too many patients at risk of chronic disease are avoiding GP clinics, despite the drawbacks of not seeing a GP.
Big ideas, so you'll be able to enjoy this program on your radio as well as on the Zoom that you are attending tonight. So everybody, I'm going to hand over to Paul Barclay and he can take over from here. Paul.
Thanks, Chrissy. Great to be here again for another of the Avid Reader Zoom events, which are really becoming a part of the furniture around here at the ABC studios where I'm coming to you from. It's great to be here virtually, as they say. And as Chrissy said, I'm recording this for my program, Big Ideas, on Radio National, and it will be on the air in the next few weeks or so. We live in a prosperous country in Australia, even if, I should say, many people are experiencing economic hardship right now as a result of the coronavirus. Australia historically rode on the sheep's back until about the middle of last century, and since then we've dug up and exported an array of resources, from uranium and iron ore to coal and liquefied natural gas. Without question, mining has generated considerable wealth for Australia, especially in more recent times coal. But what have been the costs of our economic reliance on fossil fuel revenue? Judith Brett's quarterly essay looks at this question. It's titled The Coal Curse. Judith joins us tonight via Zoom, and I should also say that Judith is Emeritus Professor of Politics at La Trobe University. Hello, Judith.
Hello.
I don't suppose there's much else to do on Melbourne on a Friday night at the moment than speak on Zoom.
That's right. We're locked down here.
You're coping okay?
Yeah. We're taking this opportunity to do quite a lot of gardening.
Yeah. It's also not a bad time to be indoors in Melbourne in July. I noticed that Chrissy just mentioned a moment ago about imagining that we were in a cold evening in Brisbane huddled together, but I can say a cold evening in Brisbane in July doesn't quite compare to a cold evening in Melbourne in July.
That's right.
So Judith, your essay is called The Coal Curse. What is it that you're referring to when you use that term, the coal curse?
Well, it started off being called the resource curse, and Chris Fike suggested the coal curse was better. Both it focused on coal, and people always like an alliteration. But the essay came from the idea of the countries which are rich in resources, that can be a curse for those countries economically and politically. So it was that idea of resource curse that was, if you like, the sort of kernel that the essay grew from. And this is a theory that economists, some economists subscribe to, not all, which is that if you look at countries with rich in resources, it can have two negative effects. One is that it can lead to a lot of political corruption, which is not necessarily, it hasn't really been the case here, but also it distorts the economy. It makes for an economy that is much simpler in its structure. And so it was that idea that I was starting off from.
Mm. Yes, the Dutch disease is also another term, isn't it?
That's right, and that came from when the Dutch discovered, that they had offshore oil, and I suppose we can see it again here with the mining boom. It's that when you get a huge boom in resources where a lot of money can be made, it sucks resources, both labour and capital, out of other areas of the economy. And it shoots up it has an effect on the value of the dollar, so your other exports become less competitive. And so in a way, what I was interested in with this essay was to give people a sort of a big picture of the structure of our economy in terms of our reliance for our export income on exporting unprocessed primary commodities, first wool, as you said, and then minerals, and what the long-term implications of that have been for us.
Yeah, it's a really instructive essay. I like the potted economic history that you provide, actually, and it gives us the ability to stand back and look at the long view of our economy, and it shows how much has changed and yet not changed, actually, at the same time. Overseas trade has made us rich, but it would be fair to say, wouldn't it, that we've not really ever been able to shake our reliance on either agriculture or minerals.
Well, for our exports, yes,
Yeah.
that's right. And that's because we didn't develop an export-oriented manufacturing sector. And, you know, we've had a manufacturing sector because one of the things I wanted to explore is the way primary commodities are fine. They make us money through exports, but they don't actually provide huge numbers of jobs. And despite the continual spruiking that the mining industry does about the number of jobs, actually it doesn't produce very many jobs at all. And that was true in the 19th century as well. But Australia wanted to be a country with a bigger population than was needed to just produce these exports. So it developed manufacturing for the domestic economy, and it developed it behind protective tariff walls. And, you know, that happened in Victoria, particularly in the 19th century. And then, you know, we know with Federation, there was the tussle over free trade and Protection won. But then in more recent history, that got a huge boost after the Second World War.
Yeah. So in a sense, it's our inability really to diversify our export economy that has characterised Australia's trading. I mean, we've moved from basically exporting primary produce and wool to more recently resources like coal. And would you say that the real barrier in terms of our inability to diversify was the fact that when we went into manufacturing, we protected that manufacturing behind a tariff wall, which essentially meant that it was never going to be internationally competitive enough to be a genuine export-based manufacturing sector?
Well, yes, that's true, but they never. The policymakers in the 50s who built that tariff wall didn't ever want it to be. You know, its purpose was to provide jobs for a growing population from migration. So after the Second World War, Australia again realised it wants to build its population, and if it wants to do that, if it wants to have a migration program, it has to have jobs, and so that actually there was no interest in diversifying our export base. Manufacturing's job, as far as the policymakers concerned, was to make things for us to buy as Australians. And also because it was using imported capital, that is, foreign companies were going to build those manufacturing capacity. Those foreign companies had no particular interest in us in building factories here which would compete with their factories in other countries in an external market. So it's not really till we get to the 1980s and the Hawke-Keating government that there's any real policy focus on the need to diversify our exports.
It's a remarkable lack of ambition, isn't it, when you think about all of the effort that is put into, for example, developing a local automotive industry in Australia, making cars here, yet never setting the ambition that, well, we'll make cars and we'll make them so well that we'll be able to sell them to the rest of the world. I mean, it's a very small picture to just think, well, we'll just make Holdens for Australians to buy.
Yeah, but why would General Motors want Australian cars to be competing with the cars they were making in America? You know, like it was, and so, I mean, that's like, the focus was really on building jobs. And look, and the thing is, for a couple of decades, it worked. You know, it provided good jobs for people in Australia. It meant our population grew. So in terms of what the policymakers in that immediate post-war period wanted to do, they were successful. It's just that things changed. And then we were very lucky that as wool really went into a sort of death spiral with the development of artificial fibres after the war, we were lucky that industrialising Japan came along and wanted to buy our minerals. Otherwise, we would have been in massive economic crisis at the end of the 1950s if we hadn't have had iron ore in particular to sell.
Look, I might come back to manufacturing because it's a whole story there that's worth talking about. But just in terms of coal, when did we start exporting coal in such vast quantities? Because the export quantities were once fairly modest. When did they really peak?
They start picking up. Just trying to remember this from the late 60s onwards. So we'd been selling a little bit of coal out of Newcastle for quite a long time, but it really starts to pick up. But it's iron ore first, and then by the 80s, it's iron ore and coal are our big export commodities, and that's when. And we're still exporting wheat and wool, agricultural products, but nothing like that. And that's when, Keating says, we've got to stop being a quarry and a farm for the rest of the world. We have to develop manufacturing exports. And that was one of his main games, if you like, when they brought down the tariffs. He and Button, they started dismantling the tariffs. The aim was to make Australian manufacturing more globally competitive. And again, that worked for a little while. By 2000, we were starting to export more elaborately transformed manufactures, as they're called. But then along came the rise of China, and it sort of made it very hard. In a way, we started too late, I think.
Well, there's that. But on the other hand, we've been incredibly lucky. I'm obviously not the first person to make that point. There's a famous book written about it. We're lucky in that when the price of wool fell, we had to replace wool as an export commodity. We had these mineral resources. And of course, we had the huge growth in Asia. The Asian economic tigers, when they took off, they needed iron ore and coal to fuel their new growing economies. And here we were in the region able to benefit as a result.
That's right. And as Britain goes into the common market at that stage, Britain had been the major market for our wool, and it's a major market through the 50s. And then all of a sudden, within really quite a short time, Japan is our major market. So again, there was, two pieces of amazing luck in that period, the late 50s and early 60s, the rise of Asia and the fact that they needed minerals.
And now we've got, only relatively recently, vast amounts of liquid natural gas that's become a relatively new export commodity, and that's gone through the roof, hasn't it?
That's right. Yes. So, but we're now, I think, the third largest exporter of fossil fuels, if you add coal and liquid gas together in the world, after Saudi Arabia and Russia.
Yes, which, of course, at this particular moment in history, places us in a particularly vulnerable situation. I mean, we may live in a country where politically we found it very hard to resolve this issue of how we deal with climate change.
That's right.
But you'd have to think that despite that, there's going to come a reckoning.
Yes.
And this is kind of what your essay is alluding to, isn't it?
That's right. And that we escaped, if you like, at the end of the 50s. And I can't see that we're going to escape this one, that at some point, despite the people keeping on talking, the coal boosters, if you like, the world is going to have to give up on fossil fuels, and demand is likely to crash, and we're very exposed because we haven't been diversifying our export base. Now, when I started writing this essay, I started thinking about it around September, October last year, and I started writing it the 27th of December as the bushfires took off. And then along comes the pandemic, and two things it did. One is it's decimated one of our success stories in diversifying our export, which was higher education. That for the first time in really the last decade or so, there's been two major service industries have been part of we've earned export income through international education and through tourism, and these are essentially service industries. So, okay, manufacturing's not there, but there's something else, not just minerals. And now the pandemic has really knocked those completely out, off the scene. so we're again highly vulnerable. And one of the things we're exporting is coal, which was a huge risk, will become a stranded asset. So, you know, it's rather grim. And I suppose, and the other thing I was going to say that the pandemic did was it exposed just how weak our manufacturing sectors become.
Indeed. And what it's also exposed is the essential tension that perhaps has always been there, but has really exploded in terms of the relationship between China and Australia, and that issue that we have where our security partner is the United States, our economic partner is China. We're in the middle of some tension and trade conflict with China. Their students are not coming to Australia anymore in anywhere near the numbers they were. Their tourists are not coming to Australia anymore. As you said, both of those sectors are wounded. And the thing that strikes me about education, Judith, in the university sector, not only was it a successful export industry, it was a successful brain-based export industry. It was Australia using its intellectual heft to, you know, create an export industry. And there's not a lot of examples of that in Australia.
No, well, that's right, because one of the things about having a sophisticated manufacturing sector is that sophisticated manufacturing requires capital input, but it also requires a lot of skill and intellectual input. And we haven't got that, but you're quite right. And one of the more shocking things, I think, about the way the government's responded to the pandemic, I mean, in many ways it's responded very well, but I think the big fail, if you like, has been its treatment of the university sector, which it's almost sort of just said, well, too bad. You know, it's very hard to understand even the fact that it fiddled 3 times with the JobKeeper policies in order to exclude the universities, where there are a lot of people now losing their jobs. There's a lot of casual and contract work, but also where the international students who were here and had come here in good faith were just stranded. Some of them were unable to go back to their countries. I mean, Scott Morrison says, well, you should all just go back home. But that wasn't always possible because some countries had their borders closed. To leave those people with no support at all, I think I find it's hard not to see a certain sort of malice in some ways almost towards the sector in those 2 aspects of the policy. Now, I suppose people will say, you would say that because, you know, you come from that sector, but...
Yeah. Several years ago, as you write in your essay, Harvard University ranked economies around the world based on their complexity, and Australia came in at number 93 of 133 countries. Almost every OECD country ranked above us. This prompted the Australian Financial Review to proclaim in a headline that Australia is rich, dumb, and getting dumber. Are we dumb? What did that Harvard index tell us, do you think?
Well, the Harvard index was based on using the what we've been talking about, the complexity of the export profile, as, if you like, a way of as an indicator of the complexity of the society. And it was just this thing that we rely so heavily on the export of unprocessed minerals, that unprocessed commodities. And as I think I said, you know, that it overstated it a bit because it only looked at commodities, it didn't include services. And so, as we've been saying, you know, we managed to have very good export in international education. I think it also probably underplayed the sophistication of our mining industries, which do have a huge amount of intellectual capital in them as well as ordinary capital. But it's pointing to the fact that, you know, we're a service economy. I mean, I just restate that. If you look at where most people are employed, they're employed in service industries, and a lot of these actually now are not that highly skilled, and that's worrying, I think. You know, the fact that Keating's vision of building a new export-focused, competitive manufacturing sector didn't come about. You know, I looked at the statistics on manufacturing employment, and actually there's fewer than 100,000 skilled metal workers now in Australia. You know, most of the people working in manufacturing, they're cooks and bakers and pastry cooks. You know, they're making biscuits and brewing beer. You know, this is not, you know, they're you know, admirable things to be doing, and we all enjoy it, but it's not quite the same as making sophisticated machine tools.
Yeah, it is curious, isn't it? Because, I mean, the thesis of your essay and the thesis of this Dutch disease concept is that if you're rich in mineral wealth, somehow that stops you from diversifying into other areas. But it shouldn't necessarily be the case that you can't reap wealth from your mineral sector and also have an advanced manufacturing sector at the same time.
No, but it would have required some more active industry policy, which was what Keating was doing. And then when Howard won in '96, they wound back some of the industry policy, but not an enormous amount. And then along came China, and everything and the mineral boom. And my sense is that people just stopped thinking about that. The politicians stopped thinking really about industry policy. It hasn't been something that's been one of the policy areas that's been talked about for the last decade.
Yeah. And Judith, that would have been perhaps in part excusable if we had used the 2000 resources boom and the wealth created from it to really set ourselves up, set up the country's future, this once in a generation resources boom that we had. Yet we went through that boom, property prices got inflated, so you know the people were able to use the increased equity in their property to, you know.
So we had massive asset inflation.
Massive asset inflation. But what do you think was it that stopped the government from realising, wow, we're in the midst of a really special time here. We can tuck some money away for the future. We can invest in infrastructure. We can set the economy up for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Instead of, as they ended up doing, giving a lot of that money back to the public in terms of what some would argue as middle-class welfare, and not really using the benefits of that period as well as perhaps they could have.
I think it was the ascendancy of neoliberalism, the idea that governments shouldn't take up too much of the resources, that governments shouldn't pick winners, that you leave things to the market, that resources get put back into private hands, that taxes don't get put too high. You know, you need a social democratic government in some ways to, I think, to run a positive industry policy, and that was not the policy framework in which this boom has happened. And I think the fact that there was a coalition government at the beginning of the boom, which, you know, in a way as we now know, the expansion of middle-class welfare under Howard and Costello, they would have said, look, the government should, if it's got extra money, it should give it back to the taxpayer. A sort of commitment to trying to lower the tax burden was ideologically where they were. And as well as that, when you see, when Rudd got elected and there was an attempt to try to have a mineral resources tax, we then saw what's, in a way, that I talk about in the second part of the essay, the incredible power that the mining lobby had accumulated over the previous couple of decades and were able to use.
Because it did seem, didn't it, when the suggestion was made that we use this moment in our economic history to tax the profits of the big multinational mining companies, those companies would still make a lot of money. They would still be well off. Their shareholders would still be well rewarded, but the country would get something out of it as well. It seemed, to me at least, and I think to some of the opinion polls at the time, that the public supported that line of thinking, yet the mining industry ran a devastatingly successful campaign that really put the kibosh on it.
Yes, and you know that, and by then the mining industry had been running successful campaigns and putting the kibosh on more progressive policies since the middle of the 1980s. I mean, one of the things that I think the essay does that I don't think's been done before. I mean, some of the stuff I do, I think, you know, it's it's just repackaging in a probably more readable way that the economic history narrative that you can find in rather dreary textbooks. I tried to make it a little less dreary for people. But is to see that there's a continuation between the way in which the mining industry organised itself to stop land rights and then to stop native title. And then when scientists at the end of the 20th century start talking about the dangers of climate change, they're already a very well organised lobby group. And we see it then, and so that the mining tax, they actually are sort of just able to push off the agenda. You know, because the mining industry doesn't employ very many people, so it can't rely totally, you know, as much on sort of electoral, you know, on an electoral push. It has to convince a broader public that the interests of the nation are aligned with the interests of the mining industry. And that's what it's been very successfully started doing in the 80s, where it was able to convince people who were not at all threatened by by land rights that somehow they would be diminished in some way, or their interests would be affected if there was a veto over mining in the land rights legislation. So they've been incredibly successful at that, and that's continued right through in the hobbling of any really effective policy on reducing our emissions.
Would you say, Judith, that the power that the mining industry has, and let's bear in mind that this is a sector that is economically significant, that delivers a lot of wealth, nonetheless, would you say that their power is disproportionate to the importance of their industry to the economy?
The thing is, we don't just live in an economy, we live in an environment and in a society. And I think that governments in making policy have to balance all of these things. And so when you look at the sort of, around the turn of the century, when they're being very effective in their campaign against any policy on climate change, the mining industry very successfully, if you like, captures the coalition government. And you see in the making of policy over climate change that they get consulted. Environmental scientists don't get consulted. I mean, we have there is a bit of an idea that governments should be looking at a range of stakeholders when they make decisions on really key policies. And what's really clear, and Guy Pearce's work is really illuminating here, is that in making decisions about whether or not we sign the Kyoto Agreement, how we approach the Paris targets, that sort of thing, the environmentalists are not getting a seat at the table. It's that the government is taking all of its cues from the mining industry. So that's what troubles me.
The other thing that's been mentioned to me by visiting authors, visiting academics that I've spoken to around the politics of climate change and emissions reductions, they cannot understand just how much power the climate change deniers have. I mean, they're used to industries lobbying in other countries, but they said that the number of people in Australia who seem to run the line that it's simply not scientifically valid, they're stunned by it.
Yes, and I think what happened, or one of the things that happened, I mean, maybe a number of things happened, is that somehow because of coming out of the 1990s, our politics became very polarised. And just going back to what I was arguing about Indigenous issues, that land rights, native title, they became very much identified with Labor and progressive politics. Mining lined up on the other side of that. So that when along came the debate about climate change, the miners are already lined up on the right, and they somehow take people who already been dismissive about Indigenous politics, and that being a bit of a marker of being a true blood conservative, somehow becoming a climate change denier and then / skeptic, which was the sort of more respectable end of it, became like a marker of identity amongst on the conservative side of politics. And I think this has been extraordinarily damaging. But it's part of it. It shows the power of the mining industry, and also, but I think it was something to do with the way our politics polarized around, during the Howard period. You get this sort of, it became, it somehow got mixed up with identity politics. I mean, it always puzzled me. The Australian was always going on about how being concerned about climate change was about identity politics, when it always seemed to me that it was being a climate skeptic or denier was where the real identity politics was happening.
Yeah, I mean, that's the conservative side. On the other hand, Labor is tied up in knots around this issue of coal and climate change too. It seems that Labor's really struggling to win office nationally at the moment, and part of the reason for that is that it can't win enough seats in Queensland to get office nationally. Regional Queensland, as we know, is pro-mining and pro-coal. They're the seats that Labor probably needs to win in order to form government nationally. And as you say, you used the term coal was weaponised against Labor at the last election. What options does Labor have politically to move on this? Political options, I suppose I'm talking about.
When that's a hard question. I mean, I think they need to sort of understand what's happened, because I think, only 40,000 people work in coal mining. So it's not the votes of the coal miners only that we're talking about here. It's the way coal has come to symbolise anti-elitism, anti the inner city. It's somehow been able to mobilise the country-city divide that's always been active in Australian politics, certainly all through the 20th century, and somehow make coal seem like the coal miners are the salt of the earth people that farmers used to be. So that people in regional Queensland who've actually got no particular direct connection with it, think that. So I think like Labor's, it's a difficult position because they're under pressure from the Greens in their inner urban seats. But they've somehow not got a narrative at the moment, a way of talking to the country. But I think they need to understand what's happening. I suppose I feel I can show the problem, but I can't really solve it.
Well, it is. You're not the only one. I mean, it is a kind of existential problem, I think. I mean, what is interesting in Queensland, where this issue has obviously played out, and where the state Labor government supports the Adani mine, for example. Nobody talks anymore about the Adani mine creating 10,000 jobs in regional Queensland. No. That was talked about for a long time, and it was the kind of, in a sense, it was almost the rationale that drove this forward. Now even Adani says, we're not talking about very many jobs, maybe 1,500 or so. But despite this, no government, state or federal, is prepared to intervene and prevent the mine from proceeding. It looks like they're not getting any finance from the big banks who are going to need to bankroll it. I mean, it's really interesting. Adani's become a kind of emblematic issue,
that's right,
isn't it? Even though the economic argument for it seems a lot weaker than it was several years ago.
Yeah, and I think that in the last election that the Greens convoy, anti-Adani convoy, was really foolish politics. That I think I said that what Bill Shorten needed was for the political debate to be focused on Labor's policies in health and education and welfare and for Adani to actually, and coal mining to be a marginal issue. But by having that convoy, it just meant that it was on the news. It provided media. It was a really, it was a really stupid move politically.
Now, recently, the mining company Rio Tinto were involved in the destruction of some Indigenous sacred sites in the Pilbara, some very important Indigenous caves going back tens of thousands of years. And it struck me that this was a very bad look for the company. Do you think that, and the public response to that, is in any way signalling a change in terms of the power that the mining industry has to just do what it wants, because what it wants is essentially good for us as a nation?
Well, look, I think the mining industry is aware that its social license is weaker than it once was. I don't think it's gone, but it's much more contested than it once was. There's these divestment campaigns of people selling their shares in banks and pressuring banks and pressuring their superannuation organisations to divest of shares and mining shares, so that the social licence is much more challenged than it was probably a couple of decades ago. And when I saw the Rio Tinto that happening, I thought, this is exactly what the legislation that Labor originally was proposing in the 1980s, which would have given Indigenous people much stronger legal position in relationship to mining companies, was designed to stop. And the mining, there was a veto of put into the original Uniform Land Rights legislation, which the mining companies managed to scare the Hawke government into dropping.
Well, the other thing that the mining companies have been quite successful at is selling the message that since native title, they've been cooperating with Indigenous groups, they've been employing Indigenous workers, and they've been discussing with them the impact of their mining operations on traditional lands. I mean, this incident just blew that out of the water.
That's right. I mean, look, and I think that, that they have in various places, because it's a complex story, been doing that, but it shows where the power really lies. They might be helping with jobs and whatever, but they're not power sharing. And I mean, it was truly shocking. And it shows that there's still a sort of deep structural racism in the relations between the extractive and the settler capitalist society that we've set up here and the Indigenous people.
You mentioned the bushfires earlier. This is seared into my memory, basically because I wasn't in the country at the time. I was in Japan on holiday, and it was so disturbing. Every night we would come back from our day of being tourists, and we'd come home and open the laptop and get onto the ABC News to see what was happening in Australia. And to watch the country burn, our country burn from another part of the world, it was absolutely shocking, actually. And I felt at the time that this must change something deeply in how we see what we're doing to the country and to the environment. Do you think it did? And do you think this, on top of the fact that we're seeing other commercial entities divest from coal, we're seeing banks reluctant to invest in some of these projects as well, do you think we are seeing, a movement away from coal with all of these factors? Well,
there's quite a lot of evidence that, capital is deserting coal as much as anything, just because of the risk. Even if the particular investing group is neutral over climate change, they know that there's lots of the rest of the world isn't. And so that, it's just a risk, and a lot of mining involves long-term investments before you're going to get a return on your money. But I think that the pandemic has pushed the bushfires away. That at the moment, what I feel is it's really hard to look more than about 2 weeks ahead. And to think long-term about how the economy could be reshaped. And what we're seeing is this rather reflex going back to economy versus environment, as if, in the way in which the coalition, it's doing a review of environment protection regime at the moment. And we'll have to wait and see what comes out of that. But we're still, you know, there's still a strong push to extract as much wealth as we can from the resources of the country, and to push the costs away from that. I mean, I found the bushfires incredibly distressing, because we camp every year down at Crowjiggalong in East Gippsland, and
that's a great part of the world.
And you know, the place we've been camping for the last 20 years with friends was all burnt. You know, I knew it well, and it's probably my favourite place on earth, really.
This is where the forest meets the ocean down there, doesn't it?
Yes, it's the point, near the Point Hicks Lighthouse.
Yeah.
And you say, okay, you know, the bush will, you know, regenerate and everything, but if these fires keep happening every decade or so, it's going to just completely change, you know, that area. And so, but I do think that with the pandemic, you know, just in the short term, it's very hard to see how we're going to get back to anything that looks like a normal social world.
It's true, and it's hard to think of anything else. But when you look at the pandemic, you see currents coming in all sorts of directions, you know, competing directions in some ways. I mean, you're seeing economic havoc being created by the pandemic and mass unemployment. That's a really big worry. And so obviously people are going to be concerned about where the jobs are going to come from in the future. On the other hand, Judith, though, there was some real concerns around supply chains.
That's right.
That led government to reignite this discussion of, we've really got to start making stuff again.
Yes.
And I wonder whether or not that might trigger some movement back in the direction of getting some advanced manufacturing starting again.
Yes, but it will require, I think, sort of industry policy. It will require a more active government than so far. Well, I mean, at the moment, obviously, I think, you know, both the premiers and the prime minister and the health ministers are just preoccupied with managing the crisis. But the current coalition is still hesitant about the idea of picking winners. I mean, you know, it's a watch this space. And I think there's now much more of an appetite in the electorate for some positive industry policy, though I think there always has been in many ways. I think people at a gut level think, you know, we need to be able to make things. We want to be in a country that make things, but we also realise that there's big vulnerabilities if we can't.
Well, perhaps, Judith, some of our options are starting to run out. Perhaps we are seeing, as you say, capital withdrawing from resource investment. We're seeing... They're
not withdrawing from iron ore.
No, that's true. That's true. But
so we've
from
still got our iron ore.
Carbon polluting resource investment like coal, we're seeing the relationship with China bound to have some devastating economic consequences. We've seen fundamental change in our university sector. That's not going to be fixed without really root and branch structural funding reform. I mean, there's a lot of things are changing in Australia at the moment that don't seem to be going to go back to normal in a hurry. And it might just be that this is the moment where we need to start thinking about the longer term economic kind of goals that we need to set for the country. I don't know. It's just COVID is a moment where you wonder whether or not, you know, politicians start to think a bit more about some of these bigger economic longer term decisions.
Well, that's what we'd hope.
Well, we need hope. Although as the other thing that's striking in your essay, I have to say, is, you know, there are moments in our history, aren't there, when politicians come forward and express this commitment to rejigging, reinvigorating manufacturing.
Yes, that's right.
It's always short-lived and it never gets off the ground. Why is that?
Well, I mean, look, the thing is, things change. You know, something lasting for 2 decades seems to me to be not too bad at the moment. And there's a lot of, I suppose, energy behind the idea of renewable energy in Australia. And there's a lot of, you know, some of the younger, more entrepreneurial people in business, I think, you know, are putting, you know, there's promise there. And it's just that I feel as if at the moment particularly with the coalition government, we've got people who are tied to the old economy and the things that trying to make the things that used to work, you know, like rebuild, getting the housing industry going again, or rather than having a bolder idea and looking at where the sort of new energy and new money's going. Yeah.
I mean, history is history, and we can kind of see that and in some ways make sense of it. When you start looking into the future, it's speculative, I know. But, you know, I also think about the fact that, I mean, I think it's fair to say that this is a government that hasn't perhaps been a government that you would see as being particularly friendly towards science. You know, for a period of time, we didn't have a science minister, for example, yet we are in this moment where we're depending on the scientists to save us from this pandemic. I mean, scarcely a day goes by without a politician saying, well, you know, if and when a vaccine arrives, well, the vaccine's not going to magically arrive. It's going to arrive as a result of the excellent research and development work of our scientists. I don't know. Maybe that starts to change some attitudes in the minds of politicians.
Yeah. And also, you know, this is a government that has been unable to have a stable energy policy and has actually not certainly when Abbott was the Prime Minister has worked hard to put roadblocks in the way of renewable energy. You know, it's so we need, you know, policy settings that will encourage investment in renewable energy, because there's a lot of money that wants to go there. You know, and it can be a big employer, and it employs the same. It can be in regional Australia, and it can employ a lot of the people who will get from coal mining. You know, so John Quiggin's just written a paper on that, and you know, it's quite persuasive. But that it requires the government to think that they need to look for new solutions, not try to just rejig the old ones.
The other thing that struck me, Judith, from reading the essay was, you know, the National Party of Australia, which was previously the Country Party, was a party that represented farmers and farming communities. Yet when you think of some of the biggest supporters today of the mining sector, mining and resources sector is doing, they are National Party members, Barnaby Joyce, George Christensen, for example. And as we know, mining and farming don't always comfortably sit side by side. I mean, have we witnessed the National Party becoming the party of mining and to some extent abandoning the agricultural sector?
Yeah, well, that's what it looks like a bit to me. And, you know, there was that famous Waleed Ali asked Michael McCormack, you know, can you tell me in an example when miners and farmers were in conflict where your party's backed the farmers rather than the miners? And he was unable to think of an example. So, I mean, I find it extraordinary. I think it's like Matt Canavan saying when he resigned from his ministry that he was proud to represent the resources industry. But I think that, going back to one of the things I was talking about before, that the Country Party's always run or the National Party, rural regional Australia versus the decadent inner city, where the salt of the earth, and they've just somehow switched from farmers to miners. But it's an unstable position for them, I think. And you can see that in the New South Wales state elections, where the Shooters, Farmers and Fishers Party has taken some of their traditional seats. You know, I think it's not necessarily a good move.
The relationship between politics and the mining sector doesn't just go one way. It's not simply that the mining sector cozies up to conservative politicians. I mean, we see many some at least former Labor Party politicians go to work for the resources sector. Peter Walsh, the former finance minister of Western Australia, was famously supportive of that sector. Since the Labor Party was unsuccessful at the last federal election, we're hearing certain Labor Party members talking about the need to reconnect with the blue-collar workers, and, you know, basically by definition what they're saying is take a less ambitious emissions reduction target forward. So it's both sides of politics, really, isn't it?
But it's the fact that the blue collar base is now seen as being the miners, you know, because we haven't got a manufacturing blue collar base anymore. You know, the people who were at the I mean, because the miners are very well paid people. I mean, we're not talking about the sort of people who were in the position when Labor was formed of the blue collar workers being the downtrodden and exploited. These guys working in mining are in very well paid jobs. When I did a piece on the drum, and I was, you know, they had a miner coming from Collinsville to challenge me, and he said, the guys here, they don't want to have a job pulling beers over there for the tourists in the Gold Coast. That's, you know, that i.e. they're a sort of aristocracy of Labor in some ways, and it's the underpaid, casualised workforce in the tourist industry, and in, you know, hospitality generally. I mean, in a whole lot of areas, that really is the people that, if Labor is about representing people who are actually less powerful, have less power in the economy, it's not the miners.
So where do you think the change, if it's going to come, will come from? What will be the currents and forces that pushes us away from this reliance on a resource that's rather dangerous to be reliant on at the moment? Not only economically reliant, but also obviously environmentally reliant, environmentally dangerous.
Yeah. I think it'll be the collapse in decline in demand from overseas. I think, you know, if for example, Europe, I mean, there's two possibilities. One is that as more renewable energy gets cheaper and cheaper, and battery storage becomes more viable, that countries we export to, like India and China, if they become less reliant on coal, our markets will disappear. Europe may impose a form of tariff on countries that are not serious about reducing their own emissions. So I think it will come from that sort of external pressure.
And
that's a dangerous position for Australia to let itself be in, I
absolutely
think.
Yeah, I mean, Australia has a choice then, doesn't it? It can double down, or it can wave the white flag and say, right, it's now time to.
Yeah, it can try to build a more resilient economy for, you know, even if they say, well, okay, we're going to keep on exporting coal while there's demand for it, but we need to actually be building some other parts of our economy as well, because this may not last even if we want it to, you know. Like, so that I see it as coming from external shocks that will come. Yeah.
I mean, there has been something to give us hope, I think, has been the bipartisan political mood that has existed for some time at least around the COVID-19 emergency. Yes. And we are still seeing perhaps a weakening of it, but we're seeing political parties across state, territory, federal lines, across the across the party divide, coming together to implement policies and approaches in the national interest. Yes. I mean, do you see any hope out of that perhaps, you know, people will look at each other a bit more in the mirror and think, well, maybe this cooperation business isn't a bad idea?
Yes, and I think that the whatever it's called, the National Cabinet, but, you know, it's not really a cabinet, but the cooperation between the Prime Minister and the state premiers is really promising, because it involves people from both sides of politics having to work together. And I think that's really promising. But it's hard.
It's hard. Look, it is hard to know. I mean, it is at least, before I was coming on to talk to you tonight, watching Scott Morrison expressing, you know, his best toward Victoria and the Victorian government. And there was just the use of language there of a federal Liberal National Party Prime Minister really generously and I think genuinely expressing goodwill toward a Labor leader because he knew what was on that leader's plate. There was just something about that I thought, gee, there's something has changed here.
Yes, and I mean, if you like, when we've had periods of successful reform, there's been that sense of synergy between the state and federal. Like when Keating was Treasurer and Prime Minister, he got on very well with Jeff Kennett, you know, and the micro, so that they were able to push the microeconomic reform agenda. So I think that is promising.
Yeah. Look, it's been great talking to you, Judith. It's a terrific essay and highly enjoyable, even for those of us like myself who have no idea about economics at all, but like to learn. Great to talk to you. Thanks very much for being on this Zoom with me tonight.
Thank you very much, Paul, for having me.
Can I also thank Avid Reader for putting it on? It's been terrific. What I'm going to do now is hand back to Chrissy, who's been compiling some questions from the Zoom audience, and I think that Chrissy will fire at least some of those questions to Judith before we wrap. But that's it from me, and thanks to all of you. Over to you, Chrissy.
Thanks, Paul. It has been fascinating to listen. I'm absolutely stunned at the idea of you writing this essay, Judith, in the middle of the pandemic, because, you know, you're talking about the future, and yet we can't think about, you know, next week at the moment and what's going to be happening. I imagine that would have been an incredible stress to finish this essay on that note.
Well, it gave me some structure to my day, and in this second lockdown, I haven't got a task, so it's a different sort of a challenge.
Maybe you need to do a follow-up to this essay in the time. I think there's more to come for sure. There is a question here from Claire about Generation Z, the kids these days that are still in high school, and Claire thinks that they're less ideologically driven than older generations, and wants to know if you have hope that we'll see an end to identity politics when they start voting. What's your thought, young generation?
I don't think I have a view on that. And I mean, it depends what you mean by identity politics too. You know, I was talking about identity politics in relationship to climate change. So yes, I don't think I have a well-informed view on that.
Right. And also the change to the focus on the move to restructure university funding to encourage the uptake of STEM degrees, subsidised by humanities, commerce and law, playing out under a government that hasn't really turned its mind to policy changes regarding sophisticated manufacturing, climate change. Do we have the industry for these young people to go into?
Well, that's a very big question there. One of the arguments that Dantian has put forward about the encouragement of STEM is that, you know, that people need to study things which will prepare them for jobs. But when you look at the graduate outcomes surveys that are done, people with STEM degrees, particularly science degrees, actually find it slower at getting employment than people with humanities degrees. So it's actually an argument that doesn't really stack up. One of the reasons being that a lot of science jobs are publicly funded. They're in organisations like the CSIRO or in government departments. And because we don't have the sort of manufacturing that people with science degrees may have once gone into. But, you know, so I don't, I mean, I just think it's an extraordinarily misguided and poorly designed set of changes that Dantian's put forward. And I've just I wrote something about this in the Weekend Australian last weekend, just pointing out that, you know, that you want your teachers to have a disciplinary training in the background, in the areas they're going to be teaching. You want a history teacher to have done a history degree. Why would you be charging them some enormous amount and then making it cheap for them to learn to be a teacher? It doesn't make sense. And also, this is a government that periodically goes into sort of a panic about how Australians don't know enough about the way their politics operate. They don't know enough about their country. Citizens don't, you know, citizenship is a bit of a blank for many Australian-born people. And I point out, you know, I taught first year politics at La Trobe University for 20 years or so. And we weren't talking about Foucault and Derrida like the Weekend Australian seems to think, you know, happens in Greece. So why would you be discouraging people from studying the politics and history and culture of their own country? It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't even make sense in terms of the things that the coalition believes in.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I completely agree with you. I think it's fascinating to think about where our education system is going and what where we should put our focus into the future. And I think that there are some issues with what's happening at the moment. Perhaps another quarterly essay in that subject alone, I would say. We have come to the end of our time together, though, and it's been really fantastic. And if everyone who's here wants to have another go at listening to this event again, it will be on Big Ideas at some point. So check out the Avid Reader website and our Twitter and our Facebook page, and we will let you know when it's going to be coming up. But it's been fantastic talking to you, and it's been fantastic having Paul Barclay with us yet again. What a great conversation. I am going to open it up so that people can have a final clap. So I'm just about to make it so that participants can unmute themselves. And if you want to, you can unmute yourself and we can have a final clap. And then I will let everyone go. So thank you very much to Paul and Judith. Unmute yourself, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much, Chrissy, for organising it.
Thank you. See you later. Bye.
Okay, bye.